Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Aaron Cuffle, and today I wanted to make a shorter video just talking about something which I see kind of popping up, especially in Protestant v. Catholic, or especially Lutheran v. Catholic kind of debates and stuff like that, and it's talking about the infallibility of certain things. Obviously, most Christians hold to Scripture being infallible, but the Apostolic churches, the Syrian Church of the East, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Roman Catholic, and sometimes Old Catholics, kind of depends, will hold that at least the 7 ecumenical councils are also infallible. But there seems to be confusion sometimes, because Protestants will sometimes also talk about usually we talk about the first 6. We don't normally hold to the 7th, but the first 6 ecumenical councils also being infallible. But doesn't this contradict sola scriptura, saying that the Bible is the only infallible rule of faith? So how can we say that the ecumenical councils and Scripture are both infallible? This really has to do with two different kind of references of infallible. One being, for example, like the Trinity is infallible, God is infallible, and then we talk about like Scripture being infallible by like nature, or for example, God being its substance is infallible. But then there's also this kind of second type of infallibility that I like to label like maybe infallibility by reference, or infallibility by its consistency to explain biblical truths. So, for example, I apologize. Something like the Nicene Creed is an infallible document. I would say that it's infallible. There's no proving it wrong, but it's not because there's something about the very nature or the substance of the creed itself, but it's only infallible in its reference to, or its correctness to Scripture in it explaining biblical truths. So we can talk about the ecumenical councils being infallible in, once again, reference towards Scripture. So, for example, like at the first ecumenical council, where Arianism is a debated topic. Arianism is clearly heretical, but there was nothing about the first ecumenical council that inherently, by its calling or by its nature of being an ecumenical council, made it infallible by itself. It's what the conclusions that came out of it were that were infallible. And once again, those conclusions aren't infallible by their very nature or substance, but they're only infallible in relation to what Scripture tells us. One might think, because of this kind of broad view and how it's only infallible in relation to Scripture, that especially within the Protestant community, wouldn't there be a lot of division and confusion onto what actually correctly relates to Scripture? But it's actually not true at all. It's actually the complete opposite, actually. Within the Protestant community, everyone from very low church, Baptist, Fundy Baptist, to very high church Anglicans and Lutherans and stuff like that, we all hold to the first 6 ecumenical councils. We normally reject the 7th, not because we don't affirm icons, but because of the veneration of the icons. And if you look at the apostolic churches, this is actually where the problem comes in, is the apostolic churches, each of them holds to a completely different number of ecumenical councils and what councils are valid. I apologize. If you look at the Syrian Church of the East, they hold to the first 2. If you look at the Oriental Orthodox Church, they hold to the first 3. If you look at the Eastern Orthodox, they hold to 7. And if you look at the Roman Catholic Church, they hold to an absurd number like 21 or 23, because after they split from the Eastern Orthodox, after the split of the 2 churches, they continued to hold basically Western councils, but they just called them ecumenical because they said everyone else was a heretic outside the church. This problem even comes up in churches that at one point are still technically united. So if we look at the Photian Schism for the 869 to 870 council, that is where Rome and all 5 patriarchs were present by their legates. They weren't all physically there, but all were represented. They anathematized Photius and kind of kicked him out of his position and reinstated Ignatius. Where the next council was the 879 to 880 council, that's reinstated Photius and condemned the Filioque as heresy, So you even see where these two churches, the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church, when they were still united as one church, that even within they're still being united, there's differences on what councils are valid and which councils are not. Oh, so I just wanted to read a quick quote because I think it's a beautiful quote by Saint Maximus the Confessor, who actually, at the time of I believe the fifth and sixth ecumenical council, that was dealing with the issue of Jesus Christ having one or two energies and then one or two wills. The correct answer is he has two wills and two energies. But I wanted to read this quote because he's talking about ecumenical councils. He's talking about an issue that's coming up where people are saying by like the nature or by the emperor calling a council that somehow infallible in and of itself. I think this quote kind of answers that. Then the saint mentioned how the synod convened in Rome by the blessed Pope Martin had condemned the monothelites, to which the Bishop Theodorus responded, "It is the emperor that summons that gives authority to a council." And Saint Maximus the Confessor responds, "If that were so, the Orthodox faith would have come to an end." And by Orthodox, he just means correct. He's not talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church. Obviously, they were going to say that, but I don't think that's true. Said Maximus, "Recall the council summoned by imperial decree to proclaim that the Son of God is not of the same essence as God the Father. The first was held in Tyre, the second in Antioch, the third in Seleucia, the fourth in Constantinople under Eusebius the Arian, who was also a patriarch at the time," which is a huge proof, I think, of some councils just being wrong, even under patriarchs, which I think does undermine some of the East and Rome's arguments for certain things. But to continue, the fifth in Nicaea and the sixth in Sirmium. Considerably later, a seventh false council took place in Ephesus, at which Dichoorus presided. All these synods were convened by imperial decree, but were rejected and anathematized, since they endorsed godless doctrines. On what grounds, I would like to know, do you accept that the council which condemned and anathematized Paul of Samosata, who was a heretic, Gregory the Wonder Worker presided over that council, and its resolutions were confirmed by Dionysius, Pope of Rome, and Dionysius of Alexandria. No emperor convoked it, but it unassailably and irrefutably. The Orthodox Church recognizes as true and holy precisely those synods that proclaim true dogmas. Your Holiness knows that the canons require that local councils be held twice a year in every Christian land for the defense of our saving faith and for administrative purposes. However, they say nothing about imperial decrees. Now, I'm not saying that St. Maximus by any means has a complete Protestant view on this. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is he's referencing and he's talking about how in reference of a council, it is true only in its profession of true biblical dogma. This is exactly what the Protestants argue, and if you look very early on with confessions of faith from, for example, Ignatius and Irenaeus, this is their exact same argument. Not obviously talk about ecumenical councils, but talk about the rule of faith. This is exactly how the Protestants argue for this, and as you can see, some of the fathers also argue in the same way. So when the kind of East or Rome claims that this is not how the councils were ever viewed, or this is not how the church ever operated, it's really kind of a quite disingenuous way to argue. Another issue I see that I think Rome and the East downplay quite a bit is that I think they downplay how many heretical councils actually happened in the early church. They were happening all the time. Like there were some here, but I'm working on another video about Eastern Orthodoxy and the councils. Hopefully I'll finish that soon. It'll take forever. But there were councils that there were totally Arian councils. If I said Eusebius the Arian, I apologize. There were tons of Arian councils, monothelite councils, monophysitism councils, and there would be a council that was valid. For example, there would be like the first council of Nicaea, and then afterwards there'd be all these little smaller councils, sometimes even represented by people that are like patriarchs and emperors and stuff like that, we claim that are not valid, and I would say are not valid because they don't teach theological orthodoxy. But when you hold to the fact that scripture is on the same level as tradition, you kind of run into an issue where the councils are on the same level as scripture. So then what do you resort to? You just have to kind of have this, you kind of have to believe that my church is infallible, and that's why it's very important for the Orthodox and Rome and all these churches to claim that they are infallible, because without it, then you're just left in kind of a theological guessing game, where as Protestants, we can look back and say, yeah, there were a bunch of ecumenical councils and there were a bunch of non-valid councils that happened. And there were even some valid non-ecumenical councils that were valid local councils. Like I believe the Council of 589 Toledo, which taught the Filioque to be a valid council. Not ecumenical, but I believe it to be a valid local council. But you see how you either have to go down the my church is infallible and never erred and kind of plug your ears and not listen approach, or you have to go down to no, there's a higher place we get our doctrine, and that being Scripture, which is the Protestant view. And I think the historically more, I think it's held by most of the fathers that that's how theological orthodoxy and correct dogma is actually gathered from Scripture. St. John Henry Newman talks about this when he talks about how in the early councils, the fathers did not argue from some place of authority or some place from the true church. They argued from place of Scripture, and that's how all doctrine was decided. But yeah, I just want to make a kind of short video talking about this, because I know I know we got a little off track and things like that, talk about the ecumenical councils, but I want to make this video because people talk about, and a lot of times ask me, like, how can you hold the ecumenical councils to be infallible, but Scripture is the only infallible rule of faith? How can these two things make sense when it's actually kind of a difference in infallibility? And I wanted to clarify, I'm not talking about infallibility in a sense, because within recent years, it's got the connotation of being everlasting, of statements having to be always true. So like you could argue that Scripture is not infallible because there were a time when the New Testament didn't exist. I'm not using that term in that way at all. I think that's a new development of the term, which we can examine. So then really the only thing we can say that's infallible is then God itself, because that God's the only thing that is eternal. And I think that's also like kind of a radical skepticism that's kind of crept into our use of language over time, that has been influenced by some enlightened philosophers that talk about like us not being able to know anything, us, not being able to reach true knowledge outside of, perhaps maybe our senses. Even then, our senses deceive us, so that we can never reach true actual knowledge. But I'm not using the term in that at all. I'm just meaning in a sense of correctness, of it not being able to err, not for all eternity, not in some time-wise thing. But I just want to say thank you all very much for watching this video. I know this was a shorter one. Normally I'm rambling on for quite a bit longer, but I appreciate you watching. I hope you have a good rest of your day, your week, your month, and your year, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.